Good morning. How much fun is this? 2 weeks is camp. Rich Dolan will be here next week. And today we're going to conclude our study on Mark in one fell swoop. So, there was so much that I wanted to talk about to close out the book. A lot of things we're not going to get to talk about. First, I think it's kind of important for me to not continue to plagiarize or anything like that, or grab any accusations of plagiarism. I want to at least cite some of the sources that I've been using this year. And specifically, there's about 6 commentaries that I very much looked at in our study. The R.T. Francis is probably the one that most academics and most scholars look to as being the commentary of all commentaries, and it's very good. But the others are very good too. There's the other 3 that I found very interesting, bringing into the Second Temple Judaism time period and some of the literature that we've talked about there. And so some of those are very, very good. Also, there's other places that I would go a lot. I know Gerald talks about Brent Kirchville a lot. I also like to go take a look at Brent Kirchville's things. In fact, I'm going to encourage everybody to go and listen to his lesson on part of today's lesson for accuracy and for another perspective that I think is valuable. N.T. Wright is somebody else. Dr. William Mounce of the biblicaltrainingstudy.org or something like that. All of these are very helpful. Of course, Kaufman's commentary is very helpful. So a lot of very helpful things to study the book of Mark. In that very first one, in that R.T. Francis, there's also, one of the things that he says right from the beginning is, hey, we're not going to reinvent the wheel on some of this. There's been some fantastic works out there, and he cites 4 different books that are categorically from history. Here's where it started and how things have been interpreted since. Some very good stuff in his introduction on, and those books are very good as well. The preface of Mark is a fantastic study. But getting to where we are today, there was stuff in Mark 12. We're going to talk about Mark 13, Mark 16 more than anything today, but Mark 12 had some fantastic things in it, specifically the greatest commandment. Mark's version is going to have the entire Shema, the prayer of Shema in it, and also it's going to bring in the Leviticus, the you shall love your neighbor in Leviticus 19:18. So it expands a little on what is in the parallel synoptic gospels. In Mark 13, which we're going to talk about today, we've got the Olivet Discourse. It's also known as the Little Apocalypse. And then, of course, the coming of the Son of Man. Mark 14 had a lot going on. This is, how do we get through a gospel book without going into the plot, the trial, all of these things? The Last Supper is one that I really looked forward to going into further study. And I would encourage, there's a lot of different conversations that go on about the Last Supper and what was that meal that they were actually having at that time. I know Mark spells it out a little differently than Matthew and Luke. And then, of course, the Synoptic 3, who call it the Passover meal, has it different than, say, John, who says it's the meal of preparation. So some interesting things about that, and there's at least one article that I was looking forward to talking about a little bit, and that was Jesus' Last Supper a Seder, which a Seder is, it's a meal that is in relationship to the event of the Passover. And there's actually several Seder meals that the Jews will participate in. And it's an interesting article talking about the history of the Seder and the things that was commanded or at least stated in, I believe, Deuteronomy, and how and what was supposed to happen at the Passover meal. I don't think it's actually instructions, but it's definitely close to instructions, and the Jews have adapted it through the years, and it's an article that goes into all that. Mark 15, we had the trials and the condemnation. We had Barabbas. Now, Barabbas, I want to talk a little bit about Barabbas real fast because that was something I couldn't wait to get into. And, of course, the crucifixion and death and burial, which obviously is the point, and the resurrection is the point of the gospel message. But the whole idea, that's always fascinated me, that they asked, who do you want to be freed? Because it was a ritual, it was a tradition that on this day they could ask for somebody to be released. And he asked, who do you want to be released? Do you want Barabbas or Jesus? And they chose Barabbas. Now, does that just confuse you? It confused me forever. But in Second Temple Judaism, or that intertestamentary period, and into this time period that we're in, the zealots, or those that were very, very important to revolt and challenging and actually going after the Roman government, they were viewed as heroes to the Jews. There was a time period where the Jewish nation had their own self-rule during all this time, where they had the Greeks and the Romans, but they had a time period, the Hasmonean family, basically the Maccabean revolt time period. This Hasmonean dynasty, they got to self-rule for a while until they messed that up. But they were seen as heroes because they were taking on these pagan, these Gentile overlords, the people that were having them under their thumb. So Barabbas was seen as one of these folks. So I really was looking forward to having a conversation about why or how could they choose Barabbas over Jesus. But and then, of course, in Mark 16 is where we're going to end today, and there is an article on Barabbas that I found interesting in Christianity Today there. But in Mark 16, we're going to talk about the empty tomb and how they fled in fear. And when we get there, we're going to talk about the ending, because I mentioned it in the introduction, and I think it's important. I think it's extremely important that we have a discussion about there's really 5 basic endings that have been passed through the manuscripts through history. 3 are pretty well known, and I think that it's a part of the conversation that our tradition probably hasn't talked about enough, just to understand why there's asterisks, why there's brackets, why our Bibles, since the King James, says something a little different than what the King James did. So we'll do that as long as we have time to get through all this. So first, before we can get into Mark 13, which is where I really want us to get, you have to remember where we were. We started in Mark 11 we ended in Mark 11 last week. You remember he's been cleansing the temple, if you will. He's had that situation with the fig tree that we're going to get into. And it's going to lead us into this time where it's going to be asked of him something that's going to lead us to eschatology. Now, eschatology is the study of end times. And eschatology, you'll hear that in articles and scholarly stuff, eschatological. You'll hear Tim say the word a few times every now and again, but that's what that's talking about. It's the study of end times. And it's going to be very important because that's what's going to be talked about a little bit in our section today. Now, going back to that fig tree back in Mark 11, if you remember, the fig tree in the Old Testament was a representation of Jerusalem, or it was the Israel basically. It was the Israel nation, and that was a representation that you can see in several instances in the Old Testament. And in our text last week, we saw that it's out of season, but Jesus saw a leaf, which you can even when it's out of season, if it's drawing leaves, it can have fruit, I guess. And he went to it, there was none, and what did he do? He cursed it. Now that's strange, that's odd, and I'm confident that without that idea or understanding of what the fig tree represented, it would make no sense. But he's not just cursing a fig tree, he's allowing us to see that he's cursing Israel. They are not producing. They have not produced. There's been no appearance of fruit. It had leaves, but it's fruitless. And he's going to curse it, which is transferring this idea into this Old Testament representation of Israel. So that's where we're being led to as we're going to be on the what they call the Olivet Discourse, or that little apocalypse. And there's the synoptic parallels are found in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. And I would encourage you to take a look at the little differences. We're going to see some of it today because they are meaningful. They're impactful at times. So as we get started, they're going to ask two basic questions. Now, in the Mark version, you're only really getting one of the questions. And it's going to take going to Matthew to really grasp what they're asking. But initially, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, they're going to ask him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? He's been talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, basically, the bringing down of the temple. And they're going to ask him, when are these things going to happen? What will be the signs of these things, so that they'll know when they're going to be accomplished? Now, it's really important to understand that there's a second part to this that we miss. But if we turn to Matthew 24, we're going to see, tell us when all these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming at and of the end of the age. Now, the Jews, they viewed things not as time period. Their time periods were the ages. They're in an age at this moment in time, and they're looking for a very specific age that we have been talking about throughout this class, and that's the Messianic age. They're ready for the Messiah. They're ready for this next time period that's going to lead them out of their overlords' oversight. They want to be self-ruled. They want to not only self-rule, they want to be put back on their place of being God's people, ahead and above everybody. And that's what they've been looking to. And that's what the whole Jewish nation's been looking for, is this Messianic age. And they're sitting there, and this would be the view of the temple. Now, the temple is amazing. During this time, the temple is amazing. What they're seeing, the unnamed disciple, which one of the commentators suggested might be Judas, but I thought that was an interesting side note. But the unnamed disciple says, look at that. Just look at that. It's amazing. Now, it's amazing for two reasons. Number one, it is God among them. The temple is representing God among them. That's where God is. That's where he's going to be during this, through their history. And so they've got God among them, and Antipas, Herod Antipas, he wanted it to be the greatest thing anybody had ever seen. The greatest temple of all temples. Now, Herod wasn't a great Jew, but he wanted to have a tie with the typical, the standard, the everyday average Jew, and he also wanted to have his Trump hotel, I guess. I don't know, but it was supposed to be all of that, and he made it all that. There's a esplanade, which is like a courtyard that is 33 acres in there that could hold 12 football fields. The perimeter was over a mile. The stones that were used, Josephus in his work said that some of the stones were 62 feet high. Now, they haven't found a 62 feet high in archaeology, but they have found 44-foot high ones. So you can see this is a massive, massive accomplishment. And on one side, Josephus says that the gold was so radiant that if the sun hit it, it would blind you. It's amazing. We need to study more about that and the accomplishments, just to understand what they were thinking when Jesus is talking about bringing down the temple. because it's not fathomable. This disciple doesn't understand it. He can't see it. It's too grand. It's too great. There's no way. And what's Jesus say? There's not going to be a stone left. These incredible stones, there's not going to be it's not going to be left standing. And in fact, when the Romans do take it down in AD 70, they did take down the stones. They didn't leave the stones the way they were. They used grappling hooks, and even if they weighed 1,000,000 pounds, they somehow got them apart because they wanted to raise it to the ground. They wanted nothing left for them to look to. And so this is the view, this is the scene, and now they've taken him aside and they've asked him those questions in private. So they're asking, the first question is pretty obvious. I think we all would recognize that. It is talking about the bringing down of the temple. Now, the rest of that question is going to be talking about that eschatology, the end of times. And it's going to be important to recognize that there is a different genre that's going to come into play here. And that genre is apocalyptic literature. Now, we don't see this anymore. When we read apocalyptic literature, if we want to read it literally, it's going to be really strange. When we did Bible Bowl with the book of Revelation, I printed pictures that had been created so that we could see what John was, putting out there, illustrating. And I'm going to tell you, those pictures were crazy. If we try to read it that Jesus is coming on a horse with a sword out of his mouth, we're probably going to be disappointed. No, we won't be disappointed, but we won't get what we at least anticipated. Because apocalyptic literature is not necessarily literal. It has some very specific things that they would have recognized and understood. In fact, that time period that I mentioned earlier, that Second Temple Judaism, that intertestamental period, this became a very, very common form of literature. Because why? We were having the revolts. This is the time period where they were persecuted greatly. Then there was a revolt, and the end times are something that they're looking to, and these revelations and these meanings and all of these things that go to this type of genre come into play. And they would have been understanding this as Mark's work is being read to them, or as they're reading Mark's work. Now, if you don't understand what I just said, just think of it this way. If I came in and I told you that I was going to tell you a fairy tale, and in that fairy tale there was going to be, I don't know, what's a good fairy tale? A talking rabbit. Or is that a fairy tale even? It's a story. Well, a fairy tale. If I came in and told you I was going to tell you a fairy tale, how many people would have thought, okay, that's a true story? Or even the parables. Parables a genre. If Jesus talks about something in a parable, are they interpreting it as a literal event? And that's the point of this apocalyptic literature and its genre. You have to recognize when you move into it. We saw it in Daniel when we studied Daniel. You'll see it in Revelation. There's other places, but those are the main things. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about Daniel in just a second. But so to return to the question, when are these things going to happen? It's most definitely talking about the destruction of the temple. It's the burning of the temple. And it's just an amazing thing that when is that going to happen? When? We want to know. And what does he say? How does he go into what to do when these kind of signs that he's going to talk about, when the signs start to happen? There's going to be some very, very specific words that Jesus is going to say. Okay, thank you, Malia. Malia's given me the definition of a fairy tale, and I should have gotten that before I went into that. Technology is wonderful. So is embarrassing your kids. Okay, so So we've got the destruction of the temple and the return of Jesus. All of this is being discussed in Mark 13, 1 through 8, or the parallels. There's going to be the prophecy of the temple's destruction. The disciples are asking the questions. He's going to give some warnings about being misled by cosmic signs. Now, the thing that's really important here is so many people want to point to these signs that get discussed in Mark 13 and say, well, that's talking about the end of times. Well, no, it's absolutely not. It's talking about this right here. What kind of signs? It's actually, when you really read it, it's the opposite, right? The instructions that he's going to give when these signs occur is to do what? It's to run to the hills, right? What good is running to the hills if it's the end of times? It does us no good. Run to the hills. We're going to see, though, there's going to be a different instruction when we make this change to that end of times language in, I believe, 24. So, persecution and the ethics, that's what this is going to be about, okay? Persecution of the disciples. When we read this in verses 9 through 13, we've got something they don't have yet. Well, they did by the time they're reading it, but when this is occurring, we haven't lived through Acts. But when we read this, isn't this Acts? They're going to be persecuted. They're going to be beaten. They're going to be chastised by these councils. There's going to be false prophets. And all of these things are going to happen. And it's pretty obvious that the things that Jesus is talking about is happening through Acts and throughout the time period from then to now. We're going to talk a little bit about typology, just a little bit towards the end, but keep in mind that the things that we see here, we have seen throughout history over and over and over again. One of the commentators wanted to point out that, and I didn't fact check him, it was Dr. Mounts. I didn't fact check him, but he said in the 20th century, there was more killing of Christians than all the histories put together, all the centuries put together. So this type of persecution, the type of things that we read in these signs will be over and over and over again. And it's the things that we're going to see in that future language it's going to apply to. So it's interesting that what Jesus is really saying with this is it's going to happen. It's going to happen soon, but not so soon. Bringing it down to the temple, there's going to be lots of things that are going to happen before it occurs. And these things were happening. They were happening. The earthquakes, all these things were happening. And the message that he's giving is don't be too hasty with what you're looking for. The main message we're going to get out of all of this is you don't really need the signs in the end of times. It's not the signs. Because guess what? It's the way you live your life. You don't get to just flip a switch. Last night I was hoping the Oklahoma City Thunder was going to flip a switch with 3 minutes left like they usually do. Christians don't get to just flip a switch. And I think that's going to be the important message out of Mark 13. So we've got the destruction of the temple, the persecution, and then this discussion. Now, we're going to see one of the major aspects is this idea of this abomination of desolation. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken about the prophet Daniel, spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And I referred to this earlier. Now, what on earth is an abomination of desolation? So Daniel 8, 9, and I believe 11 is going to, and yes, I did get that from Wikipedia. Everything they tell you, and the professors always tell you this. They said, okay, when you're starting your paper or your essay or your thesis or whatever, go to Wikipedia. Just don't cite it, okay? I cited it. Thought it was important. So anyway, I did put up the things from Daniel 8, Daniel 9, and Daniel 11 about this abomination of the desolates, or that desolates. Now, this is a fascinating part of the study because this was prophecy, which is different than the apocalyptic literature, but it's similar. But this was prophecy that is being seen at this time period right before AD 70. The Romans' armies are going to be coming, and I think a lot of the commentators want to say that the standard that the armies would bring, this was the sign of this, the one that will desolate, and I think that's an interesting thing. But the really fascinating aspect of it is they already thought this happened. During that time period, that Second Temple Judaism, there was this Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, he was what they thought was the one that desolates. He's the abomination, and that was because during his rule. It's a big. This would make for a great soap opera. First Maccabees and Second Maccabees would make for a great movie. I think there actually has been a movie that's taken an aspect of it. But there was an argument over who could be high priest. Antiochus, he backs Jason, but then when Jason goes in, takes over, there's conflict, there's issues, and so Antiochus decides he's taking his army in, and he takes over. And that's that time period where the high priest, how it's appointed, it changes dramatically during this time period. So he becomes the ruler. I believe he even wants to be called king. And there is a moment in time that begins the revolts. It was just too much for the Jewish people to take. And that was when he desecrated the temple. He put a statue of Zeus and sacrificed a pig. And there is nothing worse to these people than those two things. This was a desecration. This was the abomination. This was the fulfillment of the prophecy, they thought. And Jesus is basically letting them know, you guys missed that. You guys missed that. Either that or, and I'll just give this as a possible also, it could be another form of that typology or that pattern that I mentioned earlier. So we've got we've got those signs, we've got the false Christs that we'll read in 21-23. He's going to warn against these false Christs, these false prophets, and it's going to be important at this aspect that miracles aren't necessarily the sign of who they are from. And we talked about that briefly a few weeks ago. So just because they can do miracles doesn't mean that they are the Christos. Just because they can do this does not make them authentic, and you can see that in verse 22. So the signs of the coming man. This moves us into verse 24, and this is where it gets real. This is where a lot of the confusion, a lot of the debate, a lot of the issues come from verses 24 through 27. And we've got all kinds of different reactions that I want us to see that Jesus is talking about to identify this is different than what we've been talking about. It's 9:30 already. This is crazy. Okay, we can do it. It's so important to recognize that what was the reaction that Jesus told them to do before the destruction of the temple. Flee. He even says, hope it's not in the winter. The river's high in the river. Hope you're not pregnant. If you want to read some disturbing things, read what happened during the siege of the temple of Jerusalem in AD 70, leading into it. There was throwing from cliffs. They were killing themselves so that they were killing their families. They were cannibalism. They were eating children. There was a lot of things going on. It was horrendous what went on during the siege. So it was bad. Run to the hills. Get away. Get away fast. Now, that second question about the end of ages, we're going to see a different, we're going to skip that slide. We're going to see that different response, because now when we're talking about this end of ages, we can see that in Mark, it's not running. In Matthew, it's mourning. In Luke, stand straight and raise your heads. Does that sound like what he wants you to do when the Roman armies are about to take the city, take the temple? No. No, absolutely not. This is clearly identifying that this is a different time period. This is a different reaction. People will know when Jesus comes. This is a really important thing, because there's a lot of folks out there that think Jesus has already come. In secret. Jehovah's Witnesses, the preterists, the full preterists. I think that there's some partial preterism in a lot of the traditional commentaries on Mark 13. But the full preterists that believe that Jesus secretly came back in AD 70. A lot of misstatements, some would say heresies, apostasies, come from these verses. And it's important to recognize that we're to take note. We will know when Jesus comes. There will be no mistake about it. We will know. After the tribulation, everyone will be sure. Everyone will be sure. So, the Mark 13 is incredible study. It takes us back into the parable of the fig tree in verses 28 through 31. And from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So know the time is near, because you can recognize the signs. And that goes back to that typology that I was talking about. There's an idea that from verse 22 to verse 23, or verse 23 to verse 24, is a giant gap in time. And the one commentator likened it to when you see, well, I don't remember what it's called, come to think of it, but when you see the picture of the lion on the rock and then the sun behind them. Does anybody know what that's called? Okay. It's definitely a perspective of the camera. It looks like the sun is right there. And it's exactly what the commentators are trying to suggest is going on here. There's an idea that it looks near, but it doesn't have to be. It's the perspective. And I think Joel thought that the day of the Lord was upon him. That it would be a single solitary day. But we know, we know that was not necessarily true, because we see other days that are described in the same way that Joel described it. But the idea of this just going into back to the fig tree. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What is Jesus talking about in these verses? Well, he's talking in verses 28 through 31 a lot about these end of times, and also he's bringing back into the destruction of the temple. And it's important to try to grasp it in that perspective that was described, where what you see isn't necessarily the way you get it. You don't have to understand how it works. Just know that it's going to happen. There's going to be some final warnings in verse 32, but concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And this is confusing. I don't think we have to understand this, but one possibility is that when he emptied himself, this is something that he emptied himself of. Some might say that each of the different parts of the Trinity has different roles: the planner, the doer, the different roles, and this wasn't part of his role. There's a theology out there also that says that it's not determined yet. That the actions and the ways of the world, the ways of the spiritual world will dictate it as it comes. I don't know that I believe any of that, but it's an interesting study. But it's interesting, fascinating, my two favorite words in this class, that he says he doesn't know, but it's coming. And that's the lesson to take from this. Number one, bad things are coming. You'll be okay. Because why? Because he's returning. And we know that. Basically, bad things are coming. It's okay because God's going to win. If you want to know what apocalyptic literature is all about, it's that. Bad things are coming. It's okay because God's going to win. So, Mark 13 is hard. Not gonna try to gloss over it. It's hard. I'm confident I didn't do it service in those 38 minutes, but I was told I had to get off the stage at 45, so we're gonna move to Mark 16. Now, I introduced this in the very first class, that there's several possible endings to our book, our text. And I will just say that Brent Kirchfield's lesson on this is fantastic, because he starts his lesson, and it's only audio. I think he might have been afraid to put it in writing. Most of his stuff, he'll have a transcript, but this one he didn't. But it's only an audio, and I'll be happy to get you the link. Brent Kirchfield, West Palm Beach Church of Christ, a study of Mark. He starts off by saying, hey, I've had a bias. I started the study with a bias. I'll tell you just the opposite. I didn't have this bias, because I taught this class a number of years ago and had to address this issue, and I didn't know where I came from, really. But he started from the bias that the King James and the New King James, the way the New King James addresses this is that, the full text all the way to the long ending was authentic. He basically concluded after the more recent study that he was wrong. Now, I get that might sound weird to some folks in here, that this book might actually end at verse 8 instead of going on to the end. And I would point out, just start, since the NIV specifically, we've gotten little asterisks or little blurbs down there that explain things. And I know how our tradition and how I've always felt about the NIV. Well, I don't trust it, right? Well, this is an NIV, and I don't trust it either. But there's things in there. There's definitely some aspects in this that have been changed by the translators to favor some things that we don't believe are correct. Not really correct, but the thing I want everybody just to start with is how we have what we have, and those manuscripts. And the reason for years and years that we have believed that the full text is authentic is because most of the manuscripts have it. Most of the manuscripts have it. Probably 99% of the manuscripts have the long ending. And that's important to know, because if 99% of something, that's right. I mean, you make a 99%, you did great. The problem is the two oldest, the two most reliable, the Codex Vaticanus, it is the most complete. It's the one that they look to as being the most reliable. It and I can't say words, so I'll just say there's two of them. And the two oldest don't have it. The two oldest end on verse 8. And there's all kinds of explanations. Gospel Coalition Network has a great article on why the long ending is authentic. They also have several articles on why the short ending or not the short ending, but verse 8 ends it. There is a short ending. I guess I should throw that in there. A lot of the Bibles a lot of translations will allow this in brackets to be seen that it's a possible ending. But the things that I think is important is the manuscripts, the oldest manuscripts don't have it. A lot of those early Christian fathers, or however you want to call those folks, when they refer to Mark, they don't have it. Their text did not have anything beyond this. It appears that in the historical works where things are cited, where the sermons start citing it, is well beyond the time period in which it should have been. And because of that, you can literary criticism can pretty much tell us a lot of the words weren't the same that Mark used. I think there are 55 words in the longer version that Mark never used. And in the context and style was different as well. But that outside stuff is the thing that was the selling point to me. And that's because they didn't think it was there. They didn't think it was there. And when they do start putting in there those 99%, a lot of those scribes insert things, codes, notes, not thought to be authentic. So here is the real question for you, though. If you want to throw a stone at me right now, what do we lose from the longer version? As Christians, what do we lose? Now, there's some really good, helpful stuff in there. I mean, but is there anything that we get in it that we don't get from someplace else? The Matthew parallel has a lot of it. In fact, a lot of commentarians believe that an after source took the Matthew portion and put it in there. So the only thing we lose in that section is the handling of snakes and drinking of poison. I can live with that. I can live with it. Now, am I going to tell you for sure this or that? Not in the slightest. It's not my place. But I'm just trying to present what I believe and what I think that the text shows. So if you think that I need a stone thrown at me, I'll go outside and you can throw a stone at me as long as it's little. But the truth of the matter is we don't lose anything by losing the long ending. We don't have to be such we worship God, we don't worship this. This is His words, and we want to make sure we've got His words. And the cool thing about the manuscripts and all the things that's been provided to us, especially in the last 70 years, is we can be that much sure about what was authentic. And that's what's important with this. So I really appreciate everybody for the last the quarter. I'm going to miss you guys for sure. I'm going to move to the young adults. It's scary to me because you guys don't ask questions very much. And you guys are a great audience. They're going to ask questions, which means, oh no. Oh no. So thank you so very much. You guys have a great rest of our worship and great rest of your day.